everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming on St. Patrick's Day. Yes. I know you're going to celebrate later, but thank you for taking out the time for the second in our series. And before I introduce our panel, I'm going to let Jim go ahead and
Just to say very briefly, thank you for coming. Thanks especially to Jean. Jean Brown is the Executive Director of the Chicago Federal Executive Board, with whom we have developed a fairly close relationship over the years. The Federal Executive Board, among other things, offers a couple scholarships to our students. That'll be happening in the next couple months, and they've hired some of our people, including Mike, who you can hear from briefly. I'll let Jean introduce Mike and the rest of her staff, but just quickly to say that Jean is not only director of the Federal Executive Board, but she's a former member of the Foreign Service, and she's had a career in the federal government and is just very savvy about how to go about finding a job. So, Jean.
And before I introduce Jean, I want to just acknowledge Jeff Gobble. Jeff and I are trying to put together this series for you to make it as informative as possible, and so he and I collaborate and talk and do whatever we have to do to come up with panels like the one we have today. So Jim has introduced Jean, but let me give you a little bit more information. Prior to joining the FEB, Jean Brown worked for the U.S. Department of State, Office of Foreign Missions, assisting with services for foreign diplomats residing in the Midwest region. In assisting foreign diplomats, she drew on her experience serving at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, South Korea, and Tunis, Tunisia. Jean also served with the Department of State's Bureau of Human Resources as a career development officer to over 300 foreign service specialists. So without further ado, Jean, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Executive Report. So thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's a very popular night to go out, and I really appreciate that there's so many people here and representing and bringing. So happy St. Patrick's Day. As Dr. Rupert mentioned, I'm Jean, and I've got two people here who have worked in the Federal Executive Board. Mark Brandt is my deputy. He's a former Presidential Management Fellow, and so we'll be talking a little bit more about that program. It's also an excellent way to get into the federal government. And Mike McBurney, who was a former GCRC intern, and we're advertising now. This advertisement just came out today for GCRC interns, and he's now with DEA. He's also someone who's very savvy about working the hiring system. You've learned a lot, I think, from working with USA Jobs, and I think, congratulations are in order, because I understand you passed your written foreign service exam, so congratulations. So Dr. Report and I worked together on a few slides, just as talking points as we go through. So we'll just go through a few of these. So one thing is, even if you're not looking for a job, you should be on USA Jobs now. I love my job. I do. I come in early, I stay late, I really enjoy it. I tell Mark on days off, sometimes I come in because I want to go to an FBI briefing or a FEMA briefing. I said, well, what am I going to do at home? Watch Oprah? Like, I'd much rather be a part of this briefing. It's so cool. So, but even though I love my job, I'm on USA Jobs because I always want to know what's out there. Which agencies have money to hire right now? Which agencies, where do I see a lot of retirements? Where are a lot of the openings coming up? And I also know won't always be in this job, so I kind of want to keep my radar on what's out there. So I would have a very broad search because you want to know what your dream job is too. So I'm looking at even SES jobs, which I can't apply for right away, but I know that that's in my career path. So I'm always looking at what's open, what's opening up at different agencies. So always be looking for a job. Someone told me once you should look for a job at least every 6 months because you should know your value, or you should know where your skills are beginning to atrophy. If you see a lot of things coming up with GIS or statistical analysis, you might need to take a class in something. And that's something I'm always going back to school or always taking classes. I knew I needed to work on public speaking when I took this job, so I took a few of those classes. You always want to look at what skills are they looking for, what's out there. So always be looking for a job, even if you love your job. Conduct a thorough self-assessment. So something I tell people who work in our office, especially our FEP fellows or our new interns, I say, when you're looking for your job, look for an agency that has a mission that matches your own. I love Benjamin Franklin and Colin Powell and Madeleine Albright. So the State Department was very easy for me to gravitate towards because I was already reading their biographies. I love the stories of people who work there. So as you talk to people, try and identify an agency that has a mission that matches your own, and get very clear about what your personal mission is. And it doesn't have to be saving the world. One of my key things is having a short commute. I never wanted a long commute, and I know I lived in Korea, so that might be misspeaking, but when I worked in Korea, even then, I lived in a very small apartment very close to the embassy. And I still do that. I always try and live very close to work, because a small commute is one of, so it doesn't have to be to save the world. It doesn't have to be a huge call to service. Be honest with yourself and what it is. If you want to make a lot of money, you want to go work for the FDIC. You already want to work in public administration because you're here tonight. But what are these other things? Be honest with yourself. If it's making money, FDIC is a good agency. Commute time is something. If you want rural travel, State Department is it. Job security, those are other things that you want, are very interested in health and human services. If you're the kind of person who's at the gym at least 3 nights a week, health and human services, it would be a very congruent mission to tie yourself to. All right, so to talk to people who know and love you. That's really the best thing to do for that. All right, have a plan. So to join the federal government, it takes a long time. It's part of why you should constantly be doing research on which agencies you want to be moving towards. And this is something we've talked about. Do something every week that moves you closer to your goal, or even every day if you can do it. And it could be something as simple as sending a follow-up email, staying on somebody's radar. One of my dreams is working for the National Park Service. So if there's anything I could do to help out with the National Park Service, I help them out. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is another agency I'd love to work for someday, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Why would I want to work there? But I keep in touch with them. If there's an event going on, I go to it. If the head of that agency is speaking somewhere, I'm going to make the time to go to that. But every day, or at least once a week, if you have a dream job, do something to inch towards it. And those little steps do add up. So let me just take a minute and talk about something that I have here you should grab on your way out, and this is the best places to work. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission ranks #1. They've ranked #1 the last 3 years in a row. And this lists a bunch of other agencies that you might not realize are federal agencies or might not have heard of before or thought of. The National Science Foundation. I mean, there's so many interesting places to work. And it also lists them by large or small agency. I know I like working in large groups. I know that just matches my personality. And you might already be getting a sense of whether or not you prefer to work in large groups or small groups. So it lists them by large or small agency. So look at this and listen to yourself. What pops out at you as you're reading through this? And so match the mission, but then also keep in mind something that we've talked about before is there are some jobs that you might not think of, or agencies you might not consider initially, like the IRS. But the IRS has a white-collar crime division that's awesome. And Anthony, who was a recipient of one of our scholarships in the past, we talked about this. If you want to be a part of the FBI or the CIA or something like that, to get to those things, you might have to go through the IRS, but you can start working towards those through these other jobs. Okay. So do your research. I think we can kind of skip ahead to that one. I'm sorry, Margaret. I went ahead with a few of them. So we talked about go after the organization, not the job. And be realistic. All right. I had an intern who was having a hard time finding a job. He was excellent. He called me and said, I found the job. This is it. And I really want to go after it. And this is the one I want your recommendation for. I wasn't going to cash in my recommendation letter for just any job. This is the one I want. And it was a GS-15. I'm the director of the Federal Executive Board, and I'm not even a GS-15. And I wasn't eligible for that job. So his expectations were just way too high, and he didn't understand why he wasn't getting a job. If you've got an undergraduate degree, you want to be looking for a 5 or a 7, a GS-5 or a GS-7. If you have a master's degree, you might be able to go for a GS-9. My recommendation is just get in, because there are 2 USA jobs. There's USA jobs for the public, for public offerings, and then there's ones for existing federal employees. Because once you have your security clearance and you're in, other jobs open. So my recommendation to anyone who wants to work in the federal government is look for what you think you're eligible for. So if you think you're ready for a 9, look for 9 all the way down, anything below that. Because you just need to get your foot in the door. So prepare for the long process. All federal jobs require a security clearance. So you want to have a part-time job or not need a job right away, or be willing to take a temporary job. I did that when I was getting in. It took me about 6 months to get into my first federal job. This last one, I couldn't count on both hands how many jobs I've applied for that I didn't get. I mean, just within the last 3 years even. I shamelessly applied for many jobs and didn't get them. Yeah, you can't take it personally, you just have to keep moving forward. So there are a lot of applicants. You need to go after the jobs individually. Don't use a generic resume. Always put something that personalizes it, but be ready for rejection, because it happens. I applied for jobs at GSA several times, and this is the first one I got in on. So, and it was the right job, it was the right match, but it took me a long time to get there. So techniques and tips. We talked about, what the dream job is. We talked about, for me, the National Park Service, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Look for other ways to get into them. So if they're doing a green government event or something, I'm going to become an expert in green government. Or with this job even, I think don't write off an organization for a job if it's not exactly what you envisioned. Everyone's got to pay their dues at the beginning. You're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z until you've done A, B, and C. And this is something we talked about in our office, where we expect everyone to make coffee and everyone to move boxes when we get a shipment in of things. And I even do that. If we have an executive committee meeting, the coffee's not made, I make the coffee. We expect everyone to operate at all levels. So, but in my office, with this GCRC internship, and Mike will talk about this more in a minute, it really is a great opportunity, because it is largely administrative, but people who get this internship get access to the executive committee and get to attend all the executive committee meetings. Let me back up and just talk about the Federal Executive Board for a minute. The Federal Executive Board coordinates shared resources between all of the federal governments in Chicago. We have an elected executive committee that makes decisions on what those priorities are going to be for the year. So the intern gets to sit in on all of those meetings, and they get to know our interns. They know them by their first name. So you'll know the head of the FAA, you'll know the head of the FBI, he comes because of everything. The head of FEMA comes to all of our meetings too. So it's a great opportunity for them to get to know you. And all of our interns have been given job offers from within your office. And usually they're very directed. People get to know people, and they get highly recommended for positions. They still have to compete, but they get highly recommended. You also leave with an unbelievable Rolodex. I mean, the contacts that you have, you couldn't beat it if you want to work for the federal government in Chicago. So, do you want to talk a little bit about GCRC now? Because this is, I think, being open-minded and flexible would be a nice, this was an interesting way for you to come into the federal government.
The GCRC internship is with the Federal Executive Board. The internship itself is run through the Government College Relations Council, which is I'm not sure what the exact status is, but think of it as a collection of federal HR representatives and career counselors in universities, public and private, in the Chicago or the Illinois area. And what they do is they try to foster relationships between higher education and government, and not just the federal government. My interactions were mostly with the federal representatives, but there are people on there from local governments as well, state agencies. And so they try to facilitate the communication, the dialogue between government at all levels and the higher education system. So funneling graduates into the public service. And part of what they do, there are several job fairs. There's one at UIC, I think, somewhat recently.